Hey YouTube, Snowflarky's here today with a new episode of You've Just Activated My Trap Card, and today we are going to be activating one of my personal favorite trap cards in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Champion's Vigilance. Some of you might be familiar with this card from an era in Speed Duels, but it's never had too much relevancy in the TCG, but it's definitely a card that, especially on a budget consideration, could be useful in some decks. So, what's Champion's Vigilance? It's a counter trap card that says if you control a level 7 or higher normal monster, when a monster would be summoned or a spell or trap card is activated, you can negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. So, a trap card that's basically an omni negate for having a level 7 or higher monster. Now, this type of effect on Champion's Vigilance may sound familiar to a lot of duelists because it's pretty much the same card effect as Solemn Judgment. Solemn Judgment being a counter trap that can negate either a summon or a spell or trap activation by paying half your life points. Now, it is true that Solemn Judgment is pretty much an objectively better version of Champion's Vigilance because you'll always have life points to pay and it doesn't require you to have a level 7 or higher normal monster. But if your deck is a deck that is playing normal monsters, which there's a couple we'll go over in just a second, you now have access to additional copies of Solemn Judgment through Champion's Vigilance, especially if it's a deck that you can easily get a level 7 or higher monster to sit on the field. Quite a number of decks where you can do that, and you can choose to have a playstyle around. The nice thing about Champion's Vigilance too is this card is dirt cheap, so very easy to access. So, a Solemn Judgment-like effect for normal monsters. And so you can run 3 Solemn, you can run some copies of Champion Vigilance, have a lot of just straight up say no to an opponent's card. So, Champion's Vigilance requires you to run a level 7 or higher normal monster. So what kind of decks can this find home? Well, I have a couple that I play that I sometimes play a copy or two of this card. 3 of them, of course, are iconic cards that most Yu-Gi-Oh! Players would know. That is Dark Magician, Red Eyes, and Blue Eyes. All of these iconic Duel Monsters era monsters that have entire decks that support them. And, all of them meet that level 7 or higher criteria. 7, 7, 8. So any of these monsters sitting on the field will let your Champion's Vigilance be live. And in their respective decks, it is pretty easy to get these 3 monsters on the field. Dark Magician and Blue Eyes especially, because they each have powerful trap cards in Eternal Soul and True Light, respectively, that allow you to just special summon one from your hand or graveyard. You can do that each turn, on your opponent's turn, so that means you can even use your Blue Eyes and Dark Magicians for material, grab it back, have a Champion's Vigilance online. I even like the Champion's Vigilance because I would argue that Dark Magician and Blue Eyes are more successful, in my opinion, if you play a trap card stun-based variant over trying to do their lesser combo style gameplay. And Red Eyes, for that matter, it will have a more viable trap control playstyle as soon as we get our Red Eyes Meteor Dragon that's coming out soon. Gives it a Dictator-like D effect. But all these cards can easily sit on the field, have synergy with cards in their own archetype that want you to have Blue Eyes, Red Eyes, or Dark Magician on the field. And then in addition, you get a now additional Solemn Judgment. You could be running 3 Solemn Judgment. You could be running 1, 2 additional copies of Champion's Vigilance. Now, because of the nature of the fact that this does require you to have the level 7 or higher monster on the field, it is a card that is tough to consider running 3 of. You would have to basically guarantee you're always going to have a level 7 normal monster on the field at all times. And, when we have access to 3 Solemn Judgment, I would just say max out on 3 Solemn Judgment and run just like a copy or 2 of this card if you really like it, if you really want that effect. So, of course, the Duel Monsters era. Monsters are big on it. Another deck that I've found a place for this card on and off is Phantasm Spiral. Phantasm Spiral is a really big normal monster strategy that is pretty playable as a heavy trap card based deck. And of course, having a trap card that is an omni-negate is another thing to consider. The big thing to note is when Pacifist the Phantasm City has an effect that special summons a token to your field if you don't control one. Whenever your opponent activates a card effect and you don't control a token, you get a token. And it's not just any token. It's a token with 2,000 attack, 2,000 defense, but most importantly, it's a normal monster with 8 stars. So as soon as your Pacifist token is on the field, Champion's Vigilance is now live to be activated, which is pretty sweet. especially because in these kind of decks, if you're playing a lot of trap cards, you're probably going to be playing a lot of floodgates, and we want to be able to protect them. So, Phantasm token triggers lets your Champion's Vigilance be live. In addition, if you're playing a pure version, which is certainly not the better version, but if you're playing a more pure version where you want to play the big Phantasm Spiral Dragon, it's a pretty cool looking monster. Also is a normal monster that meets the 8-star criteria. And this card is pretty easy to summon in a pacifist version of the deck. And of course, you know, with the token, it just means that this card is pretty live in a pacifist deck. And last, a possible place that I've played this card on and off is actually in Gemini strategies. So what's interesting about Gemini monsters is you can either summon them as effect monsters by normal summoning them twice, or you can just summon them and they are a normal monster on the field. Now, Geminis have a nice field spell, Catalyst Field, that allows you to normal summon level, 5 or higher Gemini monsters without tribute once per turn, and additionally gives you 2 abilities, 2 ways to summon. So I can play Red Eyes Black Flare Dragon. I can have Champion's Vigilance. I can choose to not Gemini summon it on my first turn, so that Gemini Champion's Vigilance is live. Maybe I Gemini summon another Gemini monster. Maybe I combine it with a monster like Fossil Dyna, which is just a monster that can negate special summoning. And then I have another large monster on board. Pretty cool, especially if you want to do a card of Demise style with this. But by not Gemini summoning Red Eyes Black Flare right away, I can use Champion's Vigilance. And this is true for any level 7 or higher Gemini monsters. That includes Phoenix Gearfried and the Diox Ogre Chemi Critter, just for a couple examples. And that, makes it home. I quite enjoy the Gemini cards and the Gemini deck, and I have found the most successful way to play Gemini is to, slow it down, shove a bunch of trap cards in it, and Champion's Vigilance is a good way to do that. So those are some decks where I find a home for Champion's Vigilance. Elemental Hero Neos, of course, has some new support. You might be able to build a Neos deck that just sits on the vanilla Neos to keep this card live. Any deck where you might be able to keep a level 7 or higher normal monster on the field, especially consistently, you could throw in a copy of Champion's Vigilance if you just want another Omni negate. So now that we've established what kind of decks we could play Champion's Vigilance in, why would you want to play Champion's Vigilance? Well, mainly, as we've discussed, it's another Solemn Judgment effect. So if you have 3 Solemn Judgment and say, I'd like another one of that, Champion's Vigilance is a card you can play. And so what does Champion's Vigilance do for these decks? Well, it is an Omni negate of a summon or spell or trap card. So that means you could skillfully negate a key 1-card combo starter that maybe they're trying to normal summon, something that's going to really get their deck going, deny it on the field, or more likely, if you're playing a deck that might want to consider Champion's Vigilance, it's probably because you're playing other trap cards. And the big thing about decks like this is that when you're playing trap cards, you're probably playing the trap floodgates. These are the continuous trap cards that have some kind of limiting factor on the field to either one or both player. I'm talking about cards like Summon Limit, that make it so that no player can summon more than twice per turn. Anti-Spell, which makes spells have to be set before they can be activated. Goes in Match, you can only control monsters of the same attribute. Rivalry can only control monsters of the same type. There can only be one, you can only control one monster of each type. Or Skill Drain, just for a few examples. Skill Drain particularly good with these examples because level 7 or higher monsters are non-effect monsters, and Skill Drain is a trap card that negates monster effects while they're on the field. So of course, if you're skill draining, your monsters aren't getting negated, and but your opponents are, and that is pretty good. So, Champion's Vigilance means that if you have one of these cards set up, these cards usually being your main win condition, and your opponent maybe gets Harpy's Feather Duster, maybe Cosmic Cyclone, they're ready to remove it, Champion's Vigilance can save it. And of course, having these in addition to Solemn Judgment means you have a lot of cards that will be able to save your floodgates and keep you in a winning state of the game. So Champion's Vigilance, a good Omni negate card. If you're playing any deck that has normal monsters, it definitely is a card that you could consider throwing a copy or 2 of, especially with how easy and accessible it is. And, maybe just one extra piece of negate can keep your skill drain afloat, keep you winning, can, blank your opponent's turn for one more turn, allowing you to OTK with something like Blue Eyes that can summon a lot of vanilla monsters. Uh, just a pretty cool card. Something that I've always thought that's worth talking about, because whenever a deck you're playing has normal monsters and you can leave them on the field, definitely something to consider. So that is it for my discussion here about Champions Vigilance. Overall, a really fun card. Not a great meta game changer. All the decks I mentioned, of course, don't really have any sort of place in the meta game. But for a casual setting or, somebody with limited resources, this card can provide a lot for a deck that is playing normal monsters. And that enough is kind of warrants enough to be talked about, because that's what the series is about, talking about trap cards that are both popular and not, and just discussing anytime something like this could have an option. So thanks for checking out the video. Let me know what you think about Champions Vigilance. Have you ever played this card in Yu-Gi-Oh historically? Maybe you play it in a casual deck now. Love to know your thoughts, and we can talk further in the comments. Catch you in the next one.